All right, can everyone see that? That looks good, cool. Okay, so the official definition of a sustainable diet by the Food and Agricultural Organization, so those guys know what's up. Sustainable diets are those diets with low environmental impacts, which contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life for present and future generations. Sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems. They're culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy while optimizing natural and human resources. End of presentation.
That's a pretty comprehensive definition. So what exactly does that mean in terms of the food that we eat and the choices that we're making?
Yeah, exactly. It's very comprehensive, but it doesn't tell us too much about the actual food choices to make. So researchers at the Environmental Change Unit at the University of Oxford have devised a set of guidelines to help with actual food selection. So features of a sustainable diet are diversity, meaning a wide variety of foods are eaten, achieving balance between energy intake and energy needs, based around minimally processed tubers and whole grains, legumes, fruits and vegetables. So in other words, a plant-based diet. Meat, if eaten, to be eaten in moderate quantities and all animal parts consumed. Dairy products or their alternatives to be eaten in moderation, including unsalted seeds and nuts, small quantities of fish and seafood from certified fisheries, very limited consumption of foods that are high in fat, sugar or salt, and low in micronutrients, oils and fats, and tap water as the main drink.
So I would say that, lots of these suggestions sound pretty familiar to most of us, reducing salt and sugar, processed foods and so on. So it sounds like pretty common nutritional advice. What's the difference between that and a sustainable diet? So, why should we make these changes if not just for our personal health?
Yeah, you're right. So the suggestions for a diet which is healthy for our planet and climate friendly is not really far off from the Australian dietary guidelines for human health. So if you look here, this is our Australian guide to healthy eating. This is what we use as in practice as dietitians to guide food selection. So it's like a visual representation of the Australian dietary guidelines. So we would recommend that people enjoy a wide variety of nutritious foods from the 5 core food groups every day. And these food groups are grain and cereal foods like breakfast cereal, breads, pasta and rice, mostly whole grain, vegetables, fruit, dairy foods and their alternatives, and we'll get into that a bit later, and lean protein foods. And we recommend limiting those sorts of foods which are high in energy but low in micronutrients. We'd call those discretionary choices, and that's things like soft drink and sugar sweetened drinks, takeaway foods, chips, biscuits, cakes, all of those things. So we know that eating appropriate amounts of these core foods and limiting discretionary foods is important for our health. But food selection is also one way that individuals can have a really powerful impact on their environmental footprint. And this is because our food system contributes up to 30% of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Livestock makes up 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. So the food industry really contributes significantly to environmental degradation, to destruction of natural habitats and loss of biodiversity. It requires 70% of all fresh water, and it's the largest cause of deforestation. Food production is a major cause of soil and water pollution, and currently around 300 mammal species are being eaten towards extinction, and 33% of fisheries are overfished. Also, over 820 million people in the world go hungry every day, and 150 million children suffer from long-term hunger that impacts on their growth and development. So food is a really big social justice issue as well as an environmental issue. And while we have, on the one hand, people in the world that are still experiencing hunger and malnutrition, on the other hand, we waste a huge amount of food. So food waste alone accounts for 8% of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, so it's pretty clear that the food industry has got a huge impact on the environment and for climate change as a result. So Amy, as individuals, what are the most significant changes we can make in terms of our food choices?
Yeah, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change suggested that individuals can take the following actions relating to food: consuming less meat and dairy, buying more locally sourced and seasonal foods, and throwing away less food. And Project Drawdown, which is an organization researching climate change solutions, proposed that amongst their top 10 solutions for stopping global warming, reducing food waste was the number 3 solution, and adopting more plant-rich diets was the number 4 solution.
Great. Okay, cool. So what then, I guess, what does it actually look like if for our sort of daily diet or on our daily plate of food?
Yeah, good question. So one thing that we can all do to benefit both personal health and planetary health is to eat more plant foods. So plant foods tend to emit fewer greenhouse gas emissions than meat and dairy, regardless of how they are produced. So if you look at the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, you can see that plant foods are found in all of those core food groups, in our whole grains, our vegetables and fruits, obviously. Even in that dairy section, we would include plant-based alternatives that are contain similar micronutrients. So for example, almonds are a good source of calcium, not just cow's dairy. And there are many plant-based protein foods as well. So some tips to increase the amount of plant foods that you include in your diet. Aim to eat a wide variety of different colored fruit and veggies every day. So Australian Guide to Healthier Eating recommends 5 serves of veggies a day and 2 serves of fruit. A serve of fruit is just a medium-sized piece of fruit, or around a cup of chopped fruit. And a serve of veggies is around a cup of salad veggies or around half a cup of cooked veggies. And really try and get a variety of different colors, because then you can ensure that you're getting a wide variety of different nutrients as well from those foods. Include bread and cereal and grain foods in your diet as well. Choosing whole grain will give you optimal fiber. And try cutting down on meat in mixed dishes by swapping out part of the meat for a plant-based protein. So for example, if you're making a mixed dish like a stew or a casserole or like spaghetti bolognese, you can swap half of the mince or other kind of meat with lentils or beans or minced tofu, or some of those meat alternatives that you can buy in the supermarket these days. And often by doing this, you save money and you lower the amount of saturated fat coming from the meal as well. And try to include plant-based proteins in your diet every day. So examples of those include tofu, nuts and seeds, beans and chickpeas and legumes, those meat alternative products that I mentioned. So these kind of foods are good sources of protein, but they also contain some really important vitamins and minerals, and some of them are good sources of fiber as well.
Thanks, Amy. Look, one of the things, I guess, living in a more agricultural part of the world, surrounded by farmland like we are, some of these suggestions, particularly around meat consumption, can be a bit confronting, and I think for people to consider. Can we just talk a bit more about the reasoning behind these recommendations?
Yeah, I understand that. So look, red and processed meats have the largest environmental impact of any food. Raising livestock accounts for 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Basically, it just requires more land and energy and water to produce animal protein than it does to produce plant protein. So this graph shows how our choice of protein compares in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents. So getting 50 grams of protein from beef, you can see, has got the highest greenhouse gas emissions, followed by lamb, farm crustaceans, and then interestingly, cheese is above pork, and chicken and other poultry is not really too bad in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and then your vegetarian protein sources are going to have the lowest impact. So this is due to the land and energy use that's required for livestock. but also cows and sheep are ruminant animals, so they do produce methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. So I do really want to emphasize, though, that eating for environmental sustainability doesn't mean that everyone has to become vegetarian or vegan. So simply reducing the intake of these foods can have a significant impact on carbon emissions. So Australian Guide to Healthy Eating recommends between 2 to 3 serves of protein foods per day, very much dependent on your life stage and your gender, of course, how much protein you actually need, but around 2 or 3 serves a day. An example of a serve is something like 65 grams of cooked red meat. So that's actually about a palm size or about the size of a deck of playing cards. 80 grams of cooked poultry, 100 grams of fish, 2 eggs, 170 grams of tofu, or a cup of beans or lentils, or a small handful of nuts. So those are all examples of serves of protein foods. But our guidelines actually recommend that a maximum of 1 serve per day to come from lean meat, around 65 grams per day. And this is in order to get the important nutrients that meat provides, because it really is a powerhouse of nutrients. Meat is very nutritious food, while also minimizing some of the health risks that are associated with high meat intake. So high meat intake is associated with some kinds of cancer and heart disease. And the Heart Foundation recommends capping red meat intake at around 1 to 3 meals per week. So, however, our most recent National Nutritional Survey showed that average intake of meat was around 200 grams for men per day and 120 grams for women. So if you look at this graph here, you can see that that would put the average Australian into the category of a high meat eater, consuming over 100 grams per day. But if we all reduce our meat intake to just being a moderate meat eater, which is in line with the Australian dietary guidelines at around 65 grams of lean meat per day, we could reduce our carbon footprint by 22%. And if we didn't eat meat every day, so we had a couple of meat-free days, and then overall we might consume on average less than 50 grams of meat per day, and we're considered a low meat eater, we could drop our carbon footprint by 39%. So this is a really significant way that individuals can have an impact without having to go vegetarian or vegan. So you could try meat-free Mondays or a more flexitarian diet, which means that you increase your plant intake, but you don't eliminate meat from your diet altogether. And try some of those meat alternatives that exist in the supermarkets now. There's a broad range of those kind of veggie sausages and burgers and mince, and tofu and tempeh and nuts and seeds, beans and lentils, all those vegetarian protein sources. I'd also recommend thinking about the meat that you are eating and where that comes from. So meat like kangaroo is a good source of iron and other micronutrients. It's also very lean and low in saturated fat, and it's going to have a lower environmental impact than some of the other red meats. Also remember that recommendation from the University of Oxford to eat all parts of the animal. So that's where things like offal come into play. And we know that overall in high income countries, we do need to eat less meat. But there are some more sustainable farming methods that we can consider for the meat that we do eat. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So lots of information coming through in this presentation. So I hope everyone's taking notes of things that are of interest. And we'll get a few questions coming through. I'll put them out there at the end. So Amy, what about fish? Because that's often something that people feel is a slightly more responsible protein source to eat.
Yeah, and look, fish and seafood are very nutritious foods, great sources of protein and healthy fats. However, we know that 1/3 of the world's commercial fish stocks are now fished at unsustainable levels. So it's really important that if we're going to eat fish, we're going to try and find sustainable fish products that are sourced from certified fisheries. So one thing you can do is have a look at goodfish.org.au. It's the website, but it's also an app, and it's a free app. And it's a sustainable seafood guide designed to help consumers make informed choices about where to purchase sustainable seafood from the supermarkets or in restaurants. And there's lots of information on there. I was having a look at it last night to look up prawns to see, you know, are they sustainable or not? And there's a long list of prawns, and it completely depends on if they're farmed or if they're wild caught and where they come from. So look, there's heaps of information, and it's really interesting. But it is important that we make sustainable choices because the population of some marine species have halved in the last 40 years. Some fish species have declined by as much as 75%. And this is due to overexploitation, but also from climate change and habitat loss and water pollution.
I've put the website that Amy referred to there, goodfish.org.au, in the chat if you want to have a look at that. It sounds good if it's got an app so you can take it with you.
Yeah, so when you're in the supermarket, you can have a look.
Great. Okay, and what about, so I'm just sort of asking the questions that I imagine people think about when they're thinking about their nutrition and their choices. So what about dairy? Because I know there's lots of different types of milks that are out there now. How do our decisions about what milk or other dairy products we consume impact on planetary health?
Yeah, there are so many different plant milks available now. Look, dairy is, again, it's a really nutritious food, great source of protein and micronutrients, particularly calcium, which is so important for maintaining bone strength. And the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating recommends between 2.5 serves per day to 4 serves a day of those calcium rich or calcium rich alternatives, so not just dairy. And calcium is particularly important for women and for those that are over 70. So a serve looks like something like a cup of dairy milk or calcium fortified plant milk, or a small tub of yogurt or 2 slices of cheese. However, almonds, sardines and salmon, which have the bones in them, and tofu are also really good sources of calcium. So we don't need to get all of our calcium from dairy foods. So food choices impact on greenhouse gas emissions, but also on land use and water use. And plant-based milks do tend to fare much better in terms of their environmental impacts than dairy. So if you have a look at this graph here, this shows the environmental impacts of different types of milk per litre in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, land use and water use. So you can see that cow milk has got the greatest environmental impact, and rice and almond milk also require a large amount of water per litre. So soy and oat are going to be your best bets in terms of the environmental impact. However, I want to stress that when it comes to plant milks, from a nutrition perspective, they're not all created equal. Sometimes they're not fortified with calcium, so really try and look for ones that are. And what you're looking for is a plant milk which has got at least 100 milligrams of calcium per 100 mils. So if you look at that nutrition information panel on the side, look at the 100 mil column and the calcium, 100 milligrams per 100 mils of plant milk is going to be a best bet. And soy milk is usually the closest in terms of dairy milk from a nutrition perspective. So soy usually has a good amount of protein, and it's very often fortified with calcium and also vitamin B12. Oat milk is not too bad. Almond milk, unfortunately, is quite low in protein a lot of the time and energy. So it may not be the best choice in terms of nutrition.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's very helpful. So another one of the recommendations you mentioned earlier was reducing food waste. So can you just tell us a bit more about what impact food waste is having on the climate and planetary health?
Yeah, it has a big impact. So food waste means a waste of resources. First of all, that's a waste of land and seed and water and energy and fertilizer, labor, financial capital. If we don't end up eating the food, all of that is wasted. And we know that 1/3 of food does not make it from the farm or the factory to the fork. In high-income economies, we throw out up to 35% of food, which is huge. Food waste also has an impact on greenhouse gas emissions because when it decays in landfill, it produces methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. So food waste accounts for up to 8% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, which is huge.
Yeah. So what are some of your tips for reducing food waste?
Yeah, so as individuals, we really can play a role here. So one of the top tips is to just be a mindful shopper and not to buy more than you actually need. Try to plan your meals ahead of time and write a shopping list and really try and stick to it. And that can help you avoid buying those unnecessary impulse buys. Don't waste the food that you do buy, so store it correctly. Be realistic about cooking where you're actually going to eat. And know the difference between the best before and the use by dates as well. Try and save and eat leftovers and preserve or freeze any extra food that you've got. And a good tip, if you're a home grower and you've got like an abundance of fruit and vegetables, that food blessing service at the Seventh-day Adventist Church accepts any extra fruit or veggies they have, and they distribute that amongst the community. So that can be a good use. And if you do have food scraps left over, which is inevitable, try to send them to a home compost bin or a worm farm, or you can send them to the Armidale City to Soil compost system and pop them into your green bin.
Thanks, Amy. I'm just putting that food blessings at the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I actually don't know where that is.
It's on Erskine Street.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, there is another similar thing in town, but I can't remember where it's at. But that food blessing service, they offer like a subsidized food for people on low income, and they'll accept any extra fruit or veggies and hand that out to people. So it's a nice thing to do. I mean, you can also give them to your neighbours and friends.
That's great, thank you. So so because there's a lot of information here, and a few questions have come in, specifically around, I guess, as a dietitian, like what you recommend in terms of how can people meet our environmental responsibilities and also our nutritional needs. So, people might be a bit nervous about taking some suggestions. For example, if we start to reduce our meat intake and decide to use more plant-based milks, will we still get enough protein, iron and calcium to meet the recommended daily intakes? Can you sort of give us some feedback or some ideas about answering those questions?
Yeah, that's such an important question. First of all, I just want to say that nutrition needs vary greatly across the lifespan and in health and illness and for individuals. So an accredited practicing dietitian can provide individualized advice on nutrient and diet requirements, so keep that in mind. So a few dietary components, and you mentioned some key ones that people are often concerned about. So the first one being protein. So when switching to more plant-based protein sources, such as legumes and beans and nuts and seeds, protein quality is not compromised. So plants do contain all the essential amino acids, and plant-based diets that meet energy requirements will usually meet protein requirements as well. So the thing to do there is to include a wide variety of plant-based proteins in your diet. So that's things like beans and lentils, chickpeas, nuts and seeds. Remembering that eggs and poultry have a lower environmental impact than do red meat. And of course, still include red meat in your diet if you like to eat that. The message of this talk is really just moderating intake. Yeah. In terms of iron, that was another one that you mentioned. It's a really important one, and iron deficiency is the most common micronutrient deficiency in the world. And requirements for iron can be particularly strong during certain life stages, for example, pregnancy. If you don't have enough iron in your diet, you might feel really tired and have difficulty concentrating. So you might even be more vulnerable to infection. So it's really important to get enough. So try to eat a range of iron-rich foods every day. So there's two types of iron. There's iron that we get from animal foods and there's iron that we get from plant foods. And our bodies definitely do absorb the iron from animal foods much more easily, but we can still use the iron that we get from plant foods too. So good sources of animal-based iron is, red meat, chicken, offal. Those are great sources. But really do try to include lots of non-animal non-animal sources of iron in your diet too. So examples are things like iron-fortified breads and breakfast cereals, legumes, green leafy vegetables, nuts and nut paste like peanut butter, dried fruits, and eggs are a good source of iron too. They're an animal food, but they do have a lower environmental impact. And eating vitamin C rich foods along with your plant-based iron will help your body to absorb it better. So that's things like citrus fruits or berries, tomato, capsicum, broccoli. Those are all really good sources of vitamin C. So include those when you're having an iron-rich meal. Some foods can block your body's absorption of iron. So avoid eating these at the same time as your iron-rich meals. So that's things like tea and coffee. Tea. So unfortunately, just wait a little bit. Wait about an hour, then you can have your cup of tea or coffee. If you are concerned about your iron levels, of course, go and see your GP and have your bloods checked and have a little chat about that with your GP. Vitamin B12 is another one because primarily we get that in our diets from meat and dairy foods. Those are the richest sources of vitamin B12. And it's essential for making red blood cells and repairing body tissue. So if you're not eating those foods, some vegetarian foods are fortified with vitamin B12. So some soy milks, for example, have got B12 added to it. Yeast bread like Vegemite has got B12. And some of those meat alternative products have got a vitamin B12 fortified and added to that product too. And if it does, they'll advertise that. It'll be on the label. Zinc is another important nutrient that we typically do get from animal products, so from meat and from seafood is a really good source. And zinc's important for maintaining healthy immune systems, which we all know is so important during this day and age. It's also found in beans and nuts as well, though. So if you're including those foods regularly in your diet, then that's a good choice. And finally, calcium. Calcium is a really big one. It's essential for building bones and maintaining that bone structure throughout life, but also for healthy functioning of your heart and your muscles, blood and nerves. So cow dairy foods are really an important contributor of calcium to the diet, but they're not the only contribution. So good plant sources of calcium include some vegetables, cucumber, kale, cabbage and broccoli, nuts and seeds like almonds and Brazil nuts, hazelnut, walnuts, sesame and tahini, good source of calcium. Those fortified plant milks, and again, looking for the 100 milligrams of calcium per 100 ml. Tofu is a good source, and some dried fruits like dried figs and dates are a good source of calcium as well. Yeah, so if you have any concerns that you feel like you're not meeting your nutrient needs, I would advise you to make an appointment with your GP. You could also consider coming to see a dietitian to talk about your individual dietary requirements. Vitamin and mineral supplements are often not needed. I would check with your GP first if they advise that you take one. Yeah. Hope that answers like some of the questions around those main nutrients that we typically get from meat and dairy.
Yeah, that's great, Amy. Thank you. And we'll have a chance to be able to ask some more specific questions in a moment. We're coming towards the end of the presentation, so thanks so much, Amy, for talking to us about sustainable food choices.
Yeah, oh, no, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm really passionate about this topic. I think it's a really practical and hands-on way that we can all take action to reduce carbon emissions. It's a huge topic. We only obviously touched a couple of things today because there's more food-related climate change solutions. So like regenerative agriculture and reducing plastic food packaging, farmland restoration, clean cook stoves, composting. There's so much that's related to food.
Indeed, yeah. And is there anything else that you came to tell us that you haven't had a chance to say?
I think my final takeaway message is an encouragement to really eat more plant-based foods for both personal and planetary health. To eat meat, especially red meat and dairy foods, in moderation, to waste less food, and to choose more local and sustainable foods. And also don't be intimidated thinking that you have to be perfect. Like, as we've discussed, we do not all need to be vegetarian or vegan or waste-free or 100% local to make big impacts with the food choices that we make. So just focus on what's realistic for you. And also just want to end by emphasizing that point that individual needs vary so much in terms of nutrition. So if you do have any questions, I would really advise an accredited practicing dietitian to provide that individualized advice on nutrient and diet requirements.
That's great. Thank you, Amy. So we're finished the official sort of part of the presentation now. And we've got a chance there. There's a few questions in the chat. So I just thought I'll just run through a couple. I won't unmute everybody because I think it will just get a little bit hard to communicate. But if everyone's happy to use the chat, we can maybe work through some of these. So now I've just lost my chat. Let you get your breath there, Amy. So we had a couple of questions. Gary was asking the group, I think generally, if anyone had come across any sort of information that provides, that links the footprint of foods to the dollars invested. Is it Gary, or do you want to just unmute? Can you unmute there?
Yeah, I'd like to see data which matches footprints of anything, but food especially, with how much it costs. Because everything we buy has a footprint, and if something is more expensive but has the same footprint, then it's reducing your opportunity to have a footprint elsewhere. So I'd like to see figures of footprints related to dollars, and I never do. And I was wondering if anyone has come across that.
Thanks, Gary. It's not that I know of, but I haven't really looked in this area. If anyone has got any sources like that, Amy, is that something that it's a bit off Amy's topic here, I think, with nutrition?
Yeah, no, I'm not sure I come across anything like that. I did come across some research that that showed that embracing more plant-based diets can ultimately save a lot of money in terms of the health sector. Which I believe is related to reduction in saturated fats intake, which is highly related to heart disease, for example. So if the population embraces more plant-based diets, that can ultimately save us money in that respect, in terms of healthcare costs. But no, sorry, otherwise, yeah, sorry, I don't think I can answer your question. Good question though.
Kate put a question in talking about methane. So we all know about the ruminants. Kate was asking, hi Amy, do you know if our digestive tracts produce methane after we eat beans or lentils, and if the greenhouse gas emissions figure for beans includes our own input?
Oh gosh, that's such a cool question. I don't know. I think that the reason that it happens in cows and sheep is because they have a certain enzyme which produces methane. So for example, like the reason that pork and chicken is lower down is because those animals don't. Pigs and chickens don't. So I would assume that's the same for humans. We ferment food in our gut. Our bacteria in our gut does ferment carbohydrate foods, producing gas, but I don't think it's methane gas. Don't quote me on that. That's a really good question, though. And I did read something about how some farmers are feeding a sort of seaweed supplement to their dairy cows, and that can actually affect that process of turning of methane production, basically, and reduce the amount of methane that the cows produce. So that's pretty cool. That's a really cool thing to look out for in the future. But no, I mean, look, in general, I wouldn't worry that if you eat more beans, include more beans in your diet, that you'll be contributing to global warming in that respect. Cool question though.
Thanks, Amy. Gary also asked before, I think, I'm not sure whether you covered this when you're talking about calcium, but just asking, is all calcium digestible, or is it all sources of calcium maybe digestible? That idea of what you can actually, can we access the nutrients from the food, I guess.
Yeah. I see what you're meaning, because, you know, like how I mentioned now, there were two types of iron, and certainly our bodies can absorb the iron that comes from red meats more easily, because if you think about it, their tissue is similar to our tissue. In terms of calcium, I feel like I should know this. I'm really sorry, but I don't know. I think that it's still bioavailable. I know that the calcium from soy milk is supposed to be close to the bioavailability of the calcium that we get from dairy milk. But there are some things that do inhibit the absorption of calcium. So some of those vegetables that I said were good sources of calcium, they are, and then also we can use that calcium quite well. However, there are some other vegetables which are good sources of calcium. What are they? Okay, so kale I might have to get back to you, but they are good sources of calcium, but because they've got that phytates present in the vegetable, that inhibits us from absorbing the calcium. So it does kind of depend on the food. So in terms of how bioavailable the calcium is, which means how well our bodies can actually absorb it. But those ones I mentioned, that like the kale and the cucumber and the broccoli, then that's got the lower phytates, so we can actually absorb that calcium a little bit more efficiently.
Thanks, Amy. And that was similar when you were saying about the iron, that there's certain things that inhibit the absorption. Yeah. Is that similar then with calcium, with coffee or caffeine or other things?
I'm not sure caffeine inhibits the calcium absorption, but it does the iron.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So all pretty complex stuff, of course.
Let's just seeing something from Dorothy. The seaweed that inhibits the methanogens, methane-causing bacteria in ruminants, is Asparagus taxiformis, red algae. Oh, and it looks quite promising. Cool.
So there's quite a lot of stuff coming in the chat. So thanks everyone for sharing and using. I'm just concentrating on questions here. So Eliza has put a question, Amy, what's the preferred cooking method of veggies to get the most nutrients from them?
Oh, that's a good question. Steam them. That's a good method. Or you can stir fry them. Doesn't really matter. Just try to avoid boiling them. So when you boil veggies, some of the vitamins that are water soluble will leach out into the cooking water. And then if you then tip that out, then you're losing out on those veggies. So however you like them, I would just avoid boiling them, and steaming them in the microwave is perfectly fine for retaining nutrition.
Great, thank you. Adam's asked here a bit of a bigger picture question. So how does Australia's current national food footprint compare with the sustainable food profile you've outlined? And I think the question there is, you know, how large is the gap that we need to close?
In terms of figures, I don't know, but I would say it's far from meeting sustainable guidelines. So, for example, based on that most recent nutrition survey, the Australian Health Survey was conducted in 2011 to 13, somewhere around there. And, you know, just in terms of the meat consumption, you know, the average was 200 grams for men, 120 grams for women. So that's putting the average Australian in that bracket of a high meat eater, well into that bracket. So we know that can't be sustained, especially given, you know, the world's population is predicted to be like 10 billion by 2050 or something like that. So we can't all continue to eat that amount of meat. So yeah, I think that we're not there yet. I have certainly noticed a trend towards more plant-based diets, though, particularly amongst the younger generation. They're really embracing them. So more people becoming vegetarian or vegan, but more so even than that, just simply more people having those meat alternatives as their evening meal, having those plant-based drinks, plant-based milk drinks instead of having dairy milk. And that's the kind of trend that we need, is you know, not everyone doing this perfectly, but more plant-based foods being eaten, fewer, less red meat and dairy being eaten.
Thank you. And I'm going to be close there. I think Kate sent one through just on a direct message there. It came through, which is more about the environmental impacts of plants produced in different locations around Australia. So, you know, as opposed to dryland rice versus irrigated rice or irrigated crops. The question being prompted, I think, you know, around these things like almond plantations or almond milk becoming quite popular, but then having quite a lot of possible impacts.
Yeah.
Do you have any information or any thoughts about that sort of question?
Specifically in terms of like where to buy your rice and rice cultivation, no, no specific recommendations from me on that. So yeah, I do understand that those rice paddies are a significant source of methane, I think, because they're flooded. And however, in general, the research shows that no matter how plant-based foods are produced, they tend to have a lower environmental footprint than meat-based foods. And the travel emissions, the emissions coming from, you know, whether you're buying that food very locally or if it's traveled, that accounts for a small percent of a food's total greenhouse gas emissions. So I think the most important message we can get is that what we eat is more important than how far it has traveled, and that in general plant-based foods have a lower carbon footprint no matter how they're produced compared to red meat. Yeah, so it is all, there's so much information, and we can really get like really into the detail and try and work out what would be the most sustainable rice, for example. But I guess then the important thing is that it's rice and it's a plant-based food, so it would be a good choice to include in your diet. Yeah, so I think that it feels like it's a minefield sometimes. Like I know that I've been debating, you know, should I buy these lentils that are in bulk but came from Turkey, or should I buy the ones that are Australian but they're in a plastic package? And you know, but ultimately it's lentils, so let's buy them and not feel too guilty.
Yeah, it's like any of these questions, the devil is in the detail, and I think it's very hard to get to a simple answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's right.
Amy, I'm curious, with your work as a dietitian in HealthWise, are people looking for this kind of information from you as a professional?
Yeah, mostly a younger generation. So yeah, I do see clients who come in and they are, you know, younger, and they might want to be on a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet. So they are mostly seeking, you know, nutrition information, not this information in terms of the footprint of foods, but it's something that is on the minds of younger people, I've noticed. Yeah. So I think we're moving in the right direction with the next generation.
Great. Okay, well, we've come to the end of the presentation. We've gotten through most of the questions. People have shared quite a few views and information in the chat, so hope that's been helpful for people. Just any last chance here to ask Amy something specific about nutrition or diets before we close off? Well, I think everybody seems pretty comfortable with that information, and certainly to share that as much as possible with people who may be curious. I think that particularly around this neighbourhood that we live in, the fear of reducing red meat consumption and seems to be quite triggering for people, but this idea that maybe moving away from all the time to sometimes, or reducing it bit by bit, is a good way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a key message of this talk, that even if we're reducing meat consumption, to be within our dietary guidelines, which are based on thousands of research articles around human health. So even by making those reductions, then we can have a significant impact on our carbon footprint. And this is going to be so important in coming years. I'm just having a look at Dorothy's recent comment. Yeah, so our population is only going to be increasing dramatically in the next 20 years. And so current dietary patterns are not going to be sustainable for feeding that many mouths.
Okay. So thank you folks for coming along on your Sunday morning. It's good to see you here, and yeah, we'll look forward to connecting around these issues again soon. There'll be a message coming out through SLA soon about the local food network reinvigorating around some of these issues. So look out for that and see if you are interested in getting involved in addressing some, I suppose, food and sustainability around Armidale and surrounding area. And thanks again, Amy, for all that great information. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me here. It was a delight. Thanks everyone for coming.
All right. Bye everybody. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Bye. Just going to stay, Tanya, and have a look at all these comments.
Yeah, sure.
She read them. Good questions.
Yeah, the chat will save
Okay.
as well.
Yuki Takisawa, what are you doing here? Yuki's my friend from high school.
You can unmute and you can ask.
And Jess is my good friend who lives in Armidale, and our sons are besties.
Oh, great.
Thanks for being here, ladies. Thanks for supporting me.
Hi.
Hi. How are you?
Oh my God.
I was so excited
That's great.
to see your name pop up there.
So I'm going to be changing to soy cappuccinos from now on. Thank you.
Nice.
No more almond for me.
Oh, I know. Well, I mean, you can still have them from time to time if you prefer the taste. But yeah, I wish almond was a bit more nutritious.
Mm.
You know what? Soy milk used to taste so awful, but I feel like it's come a long way.
Oh my gosh. I remember when I used to get it when I was like 19, and it would curdle in the coffee.
Oh my God.
Like smelled like guinea pig foods or something. It was so bad. But yeah, they've come so far, and I actually really like oat milk for coffee now. And
okay.
Real too, because it's like double oat. So
I'm going to have to give that a go. I've never really thought about it.
you can buy the barista ones that are made like just for coffee, so they don't curdle and they're kind of creamy.
Yeah, right. Do you know what they do to the barista blends to make them not do
They
that?
add some oil or something.
They probably add a whole host of chemicals in there. They're probably worse. But anyway.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah,
I'm sure that's what they use.
If it's better for the environment, I will sacrifice my health.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping that organic milk would be the answer, because I really like the taste of like cow milk. Like I still drink it, but apparently it's highly variable in terms, like there's loads of reasons to choose organic food, like if pesticides and fertilizers, it is great for the environment, but in terms of the actual emissions, like there's not really any evidence that it's any better. I think sometimes it uses more land to produce the same amount of milk. And we don't have like the labeling laws that consumers can make these choices about, it says organic, but there's no information there about like the carbon footprint of